Is every Christian actually obligated to believe that Jesus was born of a virgin? Or would this be just a symbolic detail, one of those things we accept simply because we think it has always been that way? For many people, this idea sounds strange, improbable, or even uncomfortable in the modern world, so accustomed to scientific explanations and religious skepticism. But curiously, it is at the center of debates that span centuries, cultures, and crises of faith. Throughout history, this belief has been defended with conviction, rejected with force, and reinterpreted in 1,000 ways, revealing something much larger than it seems at first glance, a profound dispute over authority, reason, miracle, and Christian identity. After all, is the virgin birth an optional point of faith, or one of those pillars that, if removed, makes everything turn into a mess? By understanding where this idea came from, why it was so important in the past, and how it impacts decisions, beliefs, and debates today, you might end up reviewing not only this doctrine, but the way you view Christianity itself, and perhaps even the relationship between faith and the modern world. Imagine opening an old book knowing that if a page falls out, the rest begins to make less sense. This is more or less how many theologians explain the debate over the virgin birth. It doesn't just revolve around how to read the Bible, but how far it can be considered reliable. In the accounts of the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke, the narrative is direct, without metaphors or clues that it is symbolic language. 19th century critical historians, such as David Strauss, admitted this frankly. The text clearly teaches the virgin birth. The difficulty lay in accepting that such a thing could be true. In other words, the clash was never about literary clarity, but about trust in what is written. When this point is relativized, the question changes from "what does the text say?" to "what do I accept that it says?" Curiously, in classical theological debates, Christians have always disagreed on difficult passages, full of poetry or apocalyptic imagery, without this shaking the foundation of faith. Here, however, the scenario is different. Denying the virgin birth usually means assuming that a simple narrative and historical account can be wrong in something central, opening a delicate precedent. If this passage falls, why would others remain standing? The authority of the scriptures ceases to be a foundation and begins to function like a menu, where everyone chooses what pleases them. But if the text is so clear, why for so long did almost no one question it? When we open the oldest texts of Christianity, we do not find vague clues or ambiguous phrases thrown to the wind. The virgin birth appears directly, almost without preamble. In both the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke, the narrative is clear in stating that Mary conceived without relations with any man, through divine action. This does not arise as a poetic metaphor or as a secondary detail, but as an essential part of the story of Jesus from the beginning. Modern researchers, including critics of Christianity, usually recognize this fact. The debate is not whether the texts teach this, but whether this teaching should be accepted as true. In other words, textual clarity was never the real problem, even for those who disagree with the conclusion. This same conviction crossed centuries almost without noise, being repeated in the oldest creeds used to teach new Christians and summarize the faith in times of persecution. The virgin birth was recited publicly, memorized by children, and defended by leaders who risked their own lives, which shows the weight of this belief in the heart of the early church. Curiously, the major challenges only gained strength many centuries later, already in the intellectual climate of modernity, when miracles come to be seen with almost automatic suspicion. This helps to separate things well. It was not a historical discovery that shook the doctrine, but a change in mentality. It was not the Bible that changed first, but the glasses through which people began to read it. From the European Enlightenment, between the 17th and 18th centuries, the idea gained strength that reality can only be explained by natural, measurable, and predictable causes. Thinkers like David Hume publicly questioned the credibility of miracles, arguing that they would violate known laws of nature. This reasoning, although philosophical and not scientific, deeply influenced modern theology, creating an environment of distrust against any direct divine intervention. Thus, the virgin birth came to be seen not as a textual problem, but as a problem of plausibility. When the supernatural is discarded before reading, the result is already decided. The curious thing is that this resistance does not arise from new historical or archaeological discoveries, but from a silent assumption: miracles simply do not happen. Academic studies show that the accounts of Matthew and Luke about the birth of Jesus are ancient, independent, and well integrated into the larger narrative of each gospel, according to analyses by historians like N.T. Wright. Still, for those who adopt a strictly naturalistic view of the world, the strength of the text or the ancient consensus of the Church matters little. Christianity, however, emerged in a deeply supernatural environment, where God acts, speaks, and intervenes in human history. Removing that is like trying to watch a documentary about the ocean without accepting the existence of water. At some point along the way, the Christian faith always hits an uncomfortable crossroads, and the virgin birth is usually that silent intersection. Unlike poetic metaphors or symbolic parables, this statement is direct, literal, and difficult to bypass without intellectual juggling. Throughout history, many have tried to reinterpret miracles as figurative language, but curiously hesitate when they reach Mary's womb. This happens because here there is not much room for middle ground. Either something extraordinary occurred, or it did not. 19th century theologians already perceived this by noting that denying this point required redesigning the entire portrait of Jesus. Thus, the virgin birth ends up functioning as a narrow door that reveals how far someone is willing to go with their faith. It is like a simple thermometer, one of those old ones that does not lie or make concessions. Those who accept the idea that God entered history in this way generally are not scandalized by other central miracles of Christianity. On the other hand, those who reject this supernatural beginning usually, little by little, question the resurrection, the incarnation, and even the very notion of divine revelation. It is not about measuring who is better or worse, but about identifying internal coherence. Historians of religion point out that revisionist Christian movements almost always begin by relativizing this specific point. In the end, the test is not in Mary's womb, but in the heart of belief, how far the supernatural is still allowed to exist. Imagine removing a beam from an old house. From the outside, everything looks firm, but inside the structure begins to give way. This is how many theologians explain the connection between the virgin birth and the identity of Jesus Christ. From the first centuries, Christians understood that the way Jesus enters history already announces who he is: fully human, born of a woman, and fully divine, the fruit of God's direct initiative. The Gospels do not treat this as a curious detail, but as part of the larger plot of the Incarnation. Classical Christian theology always saw there a protection against two dangerous extremes: transforming Jesus into just an exemplary man or into a divine being distant from human experience. Without this starting point, the narrative about who Christ is begins to lose coherence little by little. This connection also helps explain why the life of Jesus is presented as singular, especially in his obedience, teachings, and redemptive mission. Ancient authors like Irenaeus of Lyon in the 2nd century stated that salvation needed to begin the right way, with God acting before any human being could claim merit. The virgin birth functions as the first sign of this inverted logic. It is not humanity ascending to God, but God descending to humanity. When this piece is treated as optional, other central ideas end up being reinterpreted, diluted, or too symbolic. And so, almost without noticing, the question ceases to be just, how was Jesus born, and becomes who he really is, paving the way for the next stage of this story. Not every battle of faith happens in grand arenas. Many arise silent in classrooms, in popular books, and even in coffee conversations. Throughout history, each Christian generation has had to decide where to yield and where to stand firm, and the virgin birth became one of those pressure points. In the first centuries, the Church faced political persecution. Later, it faced philosophical disputes. In modernity, the challenge came from the idea that only what can be measured, repeated, and tested is true. In this scenario, defending a miracle began to sound naive to some and embarrassing to others. Still, Leaders and communities insisted that Christian faith is not shaped by the taste of the time, but by what is believed to be true, not out of stubbornness, but out of conviction. This is where the so-called theological triage comes in, an ancient practice with a modern name, knowing how to distinguish what is central from what is secondary. Throughout the centuries, Christians have diverged on styles of worship, forms of church government, and interpretive details, but certain points have always required courage to be maintained. The virgin birth fits into this category because it directly challenges the spirit of each era. Today, the pressure does not come from emperors, but from a cultural sense that values social acceptance above internal coherence. Maintaining this doctrine, therefore, is not an act of religious nostalgia, but a conscious decision of fidelity. But after all, what does this birth say about who Jesus really is? Everything begins even before any human choice, like a story that was already in motion when no one yet noticed. The virgin birth in this perspective does not arise as an isolated theological trick, but as a clear sign of divine initiative, something that breaks the logic of human effort. Since the Old Testament, texts like Isaiah pointed to a salvation that would come from outside, not built by the tired hands of the people, but granted as grace. In the ancient world where male genealogies defined identity and value, Mary's narrative shifts the center of action. It is not Joseph, it is not merit, it is not lineage that starts the story. It is God who acts first. Throughout the centuries, theologians like Augustine and later Luther insisted on this point with almost pastoral clarity. If salvation begins with God, then it does not depend on our moral performance, religious intelligence, or spiritual effort. The virgin birth functions as the first note of a music that will be repeated until the cross and beyond, remembering that redemption is not a ladder one climbs, but a gift one receives. In modern times, obsessed with autonomy and self-help, this idea continues to provoke discomfort, perhaps because it takes control out of our hands. The initial question returns with even more weight. Is believing in the virgin birth just accepting an ancient doctrine, or is it deciding what kind of Christianity makes sense to follow? We have seen that this belief was never a decorative detail, but a clear sign of something larger. The trust that God acts, intervenes, and changes the course of history, even when it challenges common sense. In a world that values control, predictability, and human solutions, the idea of a totally divine beginning sounds almost provocative, like an uncomfortable reminder that not everything is born of strength, merit, or human logic. Perhaps that is exactly why this doctrine still bothers so many. So the reflection remains. If Christianity begins with a God who enters history without asking permission from natural rules, what does that require of those who say they believe in him today? Is faith summarized by what is comfortable, acceptable, and culturally plausible? Or does it still hold space for the mystery, the impossible, and the unexpected?